of LoopBack 4 framework for beginners. My name is Mario Estrada. I'm going to be writing a series of lessons so that you and I can embrace the LoopBack 4 framework to build line of business applications for mobile and web clients. Okay, so let's start with LoopBack 4. What is it? LoopBack 4 by definition is a highly extensible open source Node.js framework that is used to build applications and microservices with TypeScript. You can build anything with LoopBack 4 in the terms of servers. For example, you can build a SOAP server, you can build a GraphQL server, you can build an RPC server, and of course you can also build REST servers. We usually, whenever we go with the frameworks of Node.js, we focus only on the REST servers. But with LoopBack 4, you can also leverage HTTP2 protocols, or leverage the gRPC framework, or make use of it to create your own RPC servers. With the REST servers, LoopBack 4 supports Open API specification, also known as OAS, and also the GraphQL in order to provide this functionality to the same LoopBack 4 REST application. In this introductory training lesson, I'm going to be talking about the REST server. We are going to be building an application in subsequent lessons, which is an application for an enterprise. It's going to be an invoicing system, and we are going to make use of transactions, tables. We're going to design even the database table from scratch. I'm going to try to teach you or to transfer the knowledge that I have today that has been very useful for me in order to create large applications for the enterprise. I have been exposed to LoopBack for 2 years ago, more or less. I am one of the LoopBack 4 maintainers from the community, and I have also contributed to the framework because I think that it's really a state-of-the-art application framework and that makes me productive and very efficient when it's time to build enterprise applications. Whenever you scaffold a LoopBack 4 application, you will see that it contains certain packages. For example, Mocha is the main package used to build tests, acceptance and unit tests, Prettier to check how the style of the code is going, and ESLint, which is the analyzers and see if something is going to be wrong or is wrong with your code. Also, it makes use of Docker and includes a configuration to Dockerize your LoopBack 4 application or microservice automatically. And also it comes with a configuration file for Visual Studio Code, but you can use any editor that you wish. And of course, it brings a lot of packages from the Node.js community for validations, etc., and also packages that has been built for the LoopBack framework itself. What are the use cases for LoopBack 4? So what can I build with LoopBack 4? Well, I can build line of business applications, like monolithic applications, the one that you can probably has been developing a long time. You can have LoopBack 4 in this case to interact with SOAP services, with databases and other REST services. And through a reverse proxy, you can expose the endpoints of the REST API inside LoopBack 4 to mobile and to web applications. So you can really expose any functionality, and internally you can also place your business code in TypeScript. Now, with the microservice architecture, you can have multiple LoopBack4 applications that each of them performs a specific task and still yet leverage the legacy services internally in a company, expose a database, and still communicate to internal and external sub-web services and other REST servers. And this is more complex, but still it can think of small little LoopBack4 applications that are oriented toward a specific task and still use the reverse proxy to accommodate the needs of a mobile and a web applications. So where can I deploy once I build my LoopBack4 applications? Well, they can be deployed anywhere where Node.js is available. But in this case, since we are going to be focusing on line of business applications during the subsequent lessons, we're going to be talking about, for example, a Unix server or a Windows server with PM2. So let's talk about PM2. PM2 is one of the process manager that we have been using as a company to deploy to a specific customers. Let's imagine for 1 second that we have the LoopBack4 1, 2, 3, 4 microservices here. So we have 4 microservices. Each of them is running a specific task or is trying to solve a specific problem. Now, in this context, the remaining ones are just instances of the same microservice. So process manager PM2 is going to be managing the whole thing, and PM2 will basically is a simple and a complex at the same time, because you have to go into the documentation so you can create clusters, or you can just fork your Node.js applications. In the first 4, for example, we are going to assume that we have 3 clusters here and 2 clusters here, and the load balancing of these clusters are managed automatically by PM2 also. So, but of course we need something like a reverse proxy. The de facto one that we use is Nginx, and let's say, for example, that Nginx is exposing all these services to the outside world, and here comes the first request, goes into the PM2, and because it's managing the instances of the LoopBack4 application, is going to be sending the first request to the first one, and then there comes the second one. It goes into the second one in a round robin fashion. That doesn't mean that it only works like that. It can be configured in a different way also. So you see, you have the process manager, and still you have your consumers, and everything is really working fine. This approach, this configuration here, has been used for large companies also that we have been deploying the LoopBack4 applications to. Or, for example, you can have the LoopBack4 application Dockerized, like in this case, managed by Kubernetes, and then you can use Istio to manage the configuration, security, and the communication between the containers. So what is a high-level architecture of a LoopBack4 application? So you see that I am basically driving you to the concept of everything. It's really important that we understand the concepts graphically before we go into the coding. So otherwise, probably you will miss specific parts of the architecture. So let's review the architecture of a LoopBack4 application. In any application, regardless of the framework, you have one component which is the important component, and this is the consumers. The consumers can be humans, can be mobile applications, web applications. You have, on the other hand, servers. These servers are entities exposed by LoopBack4 applications. So we can have GraphQL, SOAP, RPC, or REST services. We are going to be talking about the REST servers, okay? So in the REST server, we have a controller. The controller is a class that is in charge of managing every request that is coming from the consumers through the server. Okay, so the controller in a LoopBack 4 application can have access to something that we call the service proxy. The service proxy is called proxy, and it's a service that exposes locally to the controller remote methods. That's why it's called service proxy. And you can have services also, services that expose local methods, and they are not related to any remote service. But in this case, this service proxy can be linked to a remote service, and it also can have access to a repository. The main difference here is that the repository can be think of a service, but it exposes database operation methods only, like select, insert, update, delete. This service proxy, okay, just before we go any further, the reason why I have placed this controller and this repository in a white background is because, for example, you can either create a file, a controller file, you can create a repository file, or you cannot, or you can create everything dynamically at runtime. So there are many times that you wish, for example, to have a rapid demonstration of the framework. You can use a CLI command, for example, to generate the controller and the repository for you on the fly at runtime, so you don't have files. In our case, through this lesson, we're going to create the controller and the repository. Okay, so that's why I just place it in a white background. But let's get back to the service proxy. So the service proxy, sorry, I just press the left key here. Okay, so the service proxy and the repository both need something called a data source, and the data source is really related to something that we call the connector, and there are many connector types. So the data source and the connector type, they are linked to the repository, and this is how the repository understands remote entities like subservers, REST servers. For example, there are connectors also for emails, and the community has been developed connectors for the majority of the entities that the services can actually work with. So in other words, if you want to talk to external services like SOAP, REST, MQ, you have to do it through a service proxy. On the other hand, the repository needs a database and a model. A model is really a shape of the data that we would like to be communicating, right? So it's like a table here, or it's a table. And the model basically and the connector through this database are needed by the repository in order to expose SQL operations to the controller. So there are models, like they are not necessarily tables, physical tables. Remember that if we are talking about a relational database management system, we have views. So we can create a view from multiple tables, and then still create a model and expose it through the repository, through the controller. So it's really up to you. We have document-oriented database management systems that they don't really need a model shape. So in that way, you have two options. You can shape it initially, or you just can have like a weak type model, and that's it. It's going to be working. The service proxy and the repository, they are being injected into the controller through something that we call the context. We're going to review about the context in the next slide. So they are injected in the controller. It means that they are available to the controller in this case. So imagine for a second that you want to have more services, more data sources, more models, more repositories, and your LoopBack 4 applications gets extended. And this is going to be in a little square that is the application, and it's going to be very large, right? Now, this same concept, this same structure, we can call it a component. And a component is going to be a LoopBack4 little application. You can think of it like that, that contains controllers, services, and business logic. But there is a special component class in LoopBack4 that you can extend, for example, a class from, and have, for example, an external package. So with LoopBack4, you can extend a component, implement your own controller, and publish it on NPM, for example, so that whenever I install the component, in reality, what I am doing is extending the functionality of the LoopBack4 application, and this is really the extensibility. And of course, for example, you can have libraries or any other NPM component inside also. So take a look at this picture. We have a consumer, we have a REST server, and we have a controller. And whether for example, the operation needs, for example, access to a database table through the repository, or call an external service, like for example a legacy SOAP web service, or calling a REST endpoint, for example, that sends an email or an SMS, then everything can be done here in the LoopBack4. Now, we are talking about the dependency injection in the previous slide. In LoopBack4, there is an entity that we call context. A context implements an inversion of control container. And this is like a central registry that all these controllers, data sources, or services are going to be registered. Who's going to be registering these artifacts? Well, it's called a booter. So a booter is going to be reading the directory, and for example, for services, it's going to be scanning the /services directory or the /controllers directory. It's going to be scanning it, it's finding, it's instantiating the controller or service, and then it's registering that instance by binding it to the context. Okay, so that is the booter, and there is a booter for one specific entity type like this. And this is the fundamental piece of work for the extensibility for LoopBack4. So we have the context, inversion of control, and everything is going to be available for the controller, for example, in this case, by using the inject. So every time we inject a service repository or an observer or anything else that can be created by its booter is going to be available here. Interceptors, I mean. Okay, so we have the context. Remember, context, IoC container, injection, repository, services. This is really important in the next few slides. So once we create an application in LoopBack4, there is going to be a file called application.ts, and I'm going to explain you this with graphics and colors because this is really important. It's even better to go into the code and explain you like that. It's in a graphical way. Your brain is going to be more open to it, right? So whenever we scaffold a LoopBack4 application, there will be an application.ts and an index.ts. So let's analyze what the content is. For the application.ts, every time that we create an application with LB4 and give it a name like hello, for example, in this case, it's going to be creating a hello application class. And you will see the source code whenever we go into it. But first of all, what it does is initially, when we declare the hello application class, we need to actually inherit from these three classes: the booter, the repository, and the service. And because in an object-oriented world that's not possible, well, TypeScript uses something called mixins. In reality, a mixins is something internally that adds the classes, the methods, from the booter class, the repository class, and the service class into the hello application class. So it's basically like adding all these three functionalities into the same class. And the booter here is really important, right? It's really important because this is the booter that we talked in the previous slide, or 2 slides before, that the booter basically is the responsible for scanning services, repositories, interceptors, and register them into the context. So every application will have to have the booter. The repository and the service are needed because this application can talk to services and repositories. So that's the Hello application class. So the first thing is that it extends with the booter mixin, repository mixin, and the service mixins. Whenever you see this line, well, that is all about. So we have the context. We understand now what is the context in LoopBack 4. So the first thing that the application class has is that it binds the sequence file in the directory into the context. So it binds the sequence into the context so that the sequence is available also for the application. Then it creates something called static. So it has a static method that mounts static assets to the REST server, and internally is using Express. So we have in the scaffolded application something called the public directory. So we serve static files through the static method here in the application by default. Of course, you can touch that and change the behavior. So there is a little file there in the public directory called index that exposes an endpoint called OpenAPI JSON. We will talk later, and then it exposes another link called /explorer. And here it goes, the explorer, right? The explorer, there is a component called explorer component, and this component is a package that contains its own controllers and its own functionality. This is the extensibility. So we need to register the explorer component into the context also, and also we need to call this component to mount all the booters for this specific component. So this component, explorer component, in reality is a LoopBack 4 little application that has to be linked into the context. But by calling this component, we need, because this is a small little application, we need to mount also its booters, and we do it with this component method that you will see in the application class file. Now, this means, for example, that controllers, services, interceptors are going to be available to the context. So the booter also that the main application class extends from in a mixin way has to register all these controllers, services, interceptors, and repositories also to the context. So you will see that whenever you find this sequence, this is what it's doing. It's binding to the context. Whenever you find this static, it's mounting static assets to the REST server. Whenever you see, for example, the Explorer component, and this component in reality is doing 2 steps. One is registering the component into the context, and the second one is mounting the booters. It is plural because, for example, there is a booter for a service, a booter for repository. Okay, so this is how the application class looks like. And then we have the index file, right? There is also an index.ts file. The first thing that the index.ts file does is that it imports the application class that we reviewed before in the previous slides. Once it imports the application class, you can configure. You will see the host and port properties right there. This is the file that you can use in order to change the host or the port. It first checks, for example, if there is something in the command line as an environment for the host and port. If it doesn't, then it has a default value. Okay, so this is after that in mind, this index.ts file instantiates an object from the application class. And remember, the application class now contains the capabilities of the booter, of the repository, and of the service, correct? So because of it, it has the boot method, and it also has, the boot method that the application, the index.ts file calls. The index.ts file, once it instantiates the application class, it will call the boot method. And the boot method is called because it's invoking the booters for the application. And remember that it already has all the booters registered, and even from external components that we're binding dynamically. And then it will call the start, and this is how it starts the application. The start does a lot of things, health checking, and register all the observers for the application life cycles, the start and stop and so on. So this is how we can analyze graphically these two files, which are important. Okay, so let's talk about the REST server. Remember, we are using LoopBack 4 in order to create REST APIs, in this case, in this lesson, but you can build anything with LoopBack 4. So we are going to be creating a Hello World application. So a controller that whenever invoke its URL path from a client, it will just say Hello World. So remember, we have the consumers, we have a server. In this case, we're going to have a REST server with different consumers. So all we need is a little controller. We don't need anything else. We don't need the repositories. We don't need the service proxy, anything at all. We only need an empty controller that we need to place our code there so that our Hello World works. Okay, so in the left, right here, you are seeing a HelloWorldController TypeScript class. This is a TS class. Very, very simple. It exposes an empty constructor. It doesn't do anything, but it has one method that says hello, and it returns a promise with the string hello. Now, how can we take this class and convert it into a LoopBack 4 controller? Well, it's very simple. With two lines of code, first we import the get from the LoopBack REST, and then we decorate the asynchronous say hello with the path to which we would like the application to serve and to call this say hello. Very simple. Okay, so too much boilerplate probably for a simple hello world, but you know, this is the thing with this type of frameworks. Initially they seem to be more complex, something that probably you can do in 3 lines of code also in pure Node.js HTTP server, for example. But whenever it comes the good things like the business logics and many business rules and many business operations, then that is exactly that we are talking about. The LoopBack 4 fits very well. Okay, so here we converted the LoopBack 4 into a controller, and that says hello world. Okay, how this is going to be traveling from the consumer? Remember, we have our /hello world. How is going to be traveling? Okay, first we have the consumer. This is really important. So this guy here is trying to call a get method with the /hello world. It's very simple. It's an HTTP request. So this is a request. The request travels to the REST server. That's it. The REST server is the one that is listening on that. But the REST server is going to be sending this request into a sequence. Okay, so the sequence is a series of steps that can be executed. It's a sequence of steps. So the first step is going to be the router finder. So this is the router finder, and well, the name implies the action in this case, right? So it's going to be trying to find the route internally to the /hello world. So it goes, of course, into the central registry and try to find the controller and its methods, and it finds one. Okay, then it tries to parse the parameters. The parameters are going to be parsed automatically for us, and they can be in the path, in the query, or in the body in this case, and then it will invoke the method. All these steps are going to be executed in a sequential way as a unit, in a unit that is called the sequence. So the sequence, remember a couple of slides before we saw that we injected into the context or registered into the context a sequence file. So this is the sequence files. And of course, you as a developer, you can create your own sequence or modify or even add or contribute with a provider to the sequence. So you can add your own step and put it into the sequence, and that's it. The provider or your step can be think of, for example, like in this case, you can add a step to check something in the security, a JSON token or whatever, for example. So this is how you intercept. At the end, this invoke method, this will invoke the method from the controller, and of course there can be a response. In this case, we are expecting the word hello world, but there can be also an error, something. Either way, the REST server will get back either of these two responses and send them back to the consumer, more or less. But the most important part here is the sequence. This is the sequence, right? The sequence is a little file that you can contribute in the steps by injecting a provider right there. Okay. So let's talk about the Open API specification. Okay, so we saw that we created a controller. I show you how the request travels, the importance of the sequence. Something important here is that there must be a description of this functionality. For example, your application can contain hundreds of endpoints or can contain only one endpoint. It really depends upon how do you want to achieve it, right? Your structure, your architecture. If it is a single LoopBack 4 application, it will contain a lot of information, a lot of endpoints. It's a full API set. If it's a microservice, probably it will be just a couple of endpoints. Regardless of the scenario, there should be something to describe this. And this is one of the most important parts also in this business. Because, for example, whenever we build applications for the enterprise, they ask us for this documentation also. And remember that the SOAP web servers contain, they had WSDL file, WSDL files, and these WSDL files describe the web service. Well, a REST server is having this similar problem, and it is solved by the Open API specification. Okay, so whenever you want to describe in a standard way your work in the REST API work, for example, you can use the Open API, unless of course you are a single developer working on a weekend project and probably you are doing something for you. Well, you should not worry about the OAS specification. But for example, usually as a developer you will have more peers working in your project. For example, take a look at it. This is the designer. Hey, the designer can actually start working before even you can start coding. Your designer of the API can use a language or a standard to define what are the methods, what are the endpoints, what are the structure of the response and the structure of the request, for example. So once this guy finishes, probably they will send it to you so that you can develop, right? So in this case, LoopBack 4 tries to please the both worlds. For example, I as a developer don't care much about the designers probably because I don't want to design in an OAS specification first. I just need to put my hands on the code and say, hey, I just need to create the controller and start testing, for example. And that is called the bottom-up approach, because you are developing the code first and then you can get the specification. So LoopBack 4 pleases you also because you can focus on the code, and LoopBack 4 will create the OAS for you automatically. Or this guy here can start developing the specification in OAS format and give it to you so that you can start working. Also, the testers, for example, let's say that you don't care much about the designer, you develop the application and then you pass the OAS to the tester. For example, imagine that you have 100 endpoints and you don't have the time to document, for example, for the tester so that it tests your API. So you generate the open API specification from a LoopBack 4 application and pass it over to the tester so that the test can use, for example, PostMan, import the OAS and starts actually seeing, what this is all about and start the tests. This is really important. So that is really important. And of course, there is another group which are the consumers. For example, the consumers, because there might be some instances or in some situations that you will need to pass it over also to the consumers, regardless if they are your customers or whatever, for example. And recently I was checking the PostMan, for example, and they have the capability of generating a documentation from your OAS also. So this is nice. This is a really an important feature. So in LoopBack 4, as I mentioned before in the previous slide, it supports you as a developer and supports the designer also as the designer. So it basically, there are two ways to support the Open API here. The first is called the bottom-up approach, because we as developers, we just start creating the artifacts, controllers, services, and start coding. We don't have to worry much about Open API probably at some point. And then we can generate LoopBack 4 application. Or there can be a designer that provides an Open API specification, and from it we can generate the LoopBack 4 application also. Either way, the LoopBack 4 application generates to the consumers, testers, designers, you, any other team or whatever, the OAS specification file. And LoopBack 4, for example, can generate, as I said before in the previous slide, a controller or something from the OAS specification. And this is how the OAS specification looks like in the case you haven't seen a file. So this is describing the service and the paths. In this case, this is the HelloWorld from the previous slides. The controller name is HelloWorldController, the operation name is HelloWorld, and that's it. So the text was cut here on purpose, but from this we can generate this. So this is called the top-down approach. Okay, so how we can generate then the Open API specification? Well, we just, for example, if we're talking about the bottom-up approach, we just have to focus on generating our code. And LoopBack 4 can either help us in generating it by accessing the host name of our application and the port number /openapi.json. So if I open a browser and with this openapi.json at the end, I will grab, for example, the full Open API specification for my application. Or from the root of your application, you can run npm run openapi-spec, the file name, and with an extension. Can be either YAML or JSON. Depends upon the extension, it will generate in the YAML format or in the JSON format. And more information about it, you can go to their GitHub Open API specification, find out more information about it on Open APIs, or you can follow this tutorial, for example, from Swagger, or you can Google. There are plenty of it. And you will see that this is really important, because it's not just really to mount an endpoint and do something and send it back as a JSON. It's not just like that. In the real world, we are really required to adhere to these standards, and the Open API specification is really important in this development and deployment cycle. So how do we install LoopBack 4? Well, you always, as usual, check the documentation first. Don't rely on any video, because something might have changed from time to time, right? Probably today I will be publishing it, and then in 2 days something is different. So I always check the official documentation. This is the URL. Probably it will even change in the future also. But in this case, just make sure you have a specific version of Node.js installed, and something like, for example, in my case, I'm going to be dealing with 10.19.0, for example, but I have 12 also installed here on my computer. And then you just install LoopBack globally at LoopBack CLI, for example. So you run npm install -g at LoopBack CLI, and it will automatically install the LB4 CLI tool for you. And then we are going to, for these lessons, we're going to be creating a directory called LB4 intro. We're going to be changing to it, and then we can start working. So this lesson will cover the scaffolding of a LoopBack 4 application, generating the HelloWorldController, and we are going to be returning an object, not a string, and we are going to be generating our test integrations with Mocha. Then we're going to review the OpenAPI specification and run a test. In the next lesson, we're going to be having the same mechanism like this one here, but we're going to review the models, the services, the repositories, and we are going to create a couple of tables in a relational database management system. Can be MySQL, for example, and we're going to be start building our applications that we will be building. This is an invoicing system. So get ready, let's code the controller. For application, in my case, I'm having the version 10.19.0, and my LoopBack 4 version is 2.8.0, I guess. Let me double check that. Yeah, 2.8.0, which is the CLI. Okay, I am running LB4 hello. It's gonna be asking me for a description of it. This is my first application, and then everything is gonna be entered. This is the hello application. I want all these features, the ESLint, printer, Docker, repository, services, and it created the application already, as you can see. Now it's downloading and installing the packages. Well, it's doing that. Let's review rapidly all this here. These dot files are configuration files specific for ESLint, Mocha, Prettier. I explained already about these packages and why their importance in the application. The VSCode file is for the Visual Studio Code editor, but you can use anyone. The Git and the Git ignore and Docker ignore are specifically for the Git client utility or the Docker file, which is the configuration for the Dockerization of this application in this case. So we see the public index.html file. So the public index.html file is the file that is served static in a static way, right? And the application and the index, which basically we saw it already. The OpenAPI spec basically is the utility that you or the command from the command line utility that you can command line interface that you can import in order to create the OpenAPI specification and our sequence, our tests, and the controller, data source, models, repositories that are empty right now, right? So from here, I'm going to go to the hello. I am not going to start the application right now. Instead, I'm going to be creating my HelloWorldController. And the HelloWorldController will ask me if I want a controller that contains SQL operations, CRUD functions. In this case, no, I'm selecting the empty controller, and it created the controller already. So I'm going to be copying it, Command V, and then VI it. I'm removing everything. I just need to import the get decorator from the LoopBack REST package. I just need to decorate the hello world here, and then this is gonna be an asynchronous say hello it's returning a promise that for now is going to be a string, and this will be returning hello world. In the case of, in our case, we just need to, yes, it was called, to debug it right here, and that's it. So I need to start it, and it's going to be running on port number 3000 if everything is fine. Everything is fine, so I just need this terminal here, and from here I will call HTTP localhost 3000 hello world. Okay, and that's it. Yeah, it returned hello world, and right here it says yes, it was called, so it's fine. Now let's query, or let's get the openapi.json file. So this is the description of our hello world endpoint, the get operation, the hello world path, the controller, the method. It matches pretty well, and the response doesn't contain a content here, right? It just contains the description and the 200. So something is missing here, because our hello world, because it was custom made, could not be interpreted by the process that generates this OpenAPI specification. You will then take a look at this pin, which is the controller that comes by default, that its response is basically defined here. So this is an object, and this is really important. You don't have to do this automatically. LoopBack 4 will do it for you in whenever it comes for the models. But in our case, we just need something in the response. Okay, so I'm gonna try to fix it. Again, you don't have to do it. I will just do it just to show you this. But I will use the second parameter of the get decorator in this case. So this will say responses. Okay, so these are the responses, and the responses will contain, this BI does not help me with the indentation, 1, 2, 3. The responses will contain the 200, and we'll also have the description. I will this is our new description, and it will also contain some content. Okay, in the content, this is returning an application JSON object, and it contains a schema. And with its schema, we are returning something very simple, which is a type string, and that's it. Right? So we just add it here. We don't need to do it. I just wanted to do it right now for you to take a look at it. So I will start it again. If everything is fine, it will run again in the same port. Everything is fine, and we can query it back with the OpenAPI JSON endpoint, and you will see that the hello world now has the new description, but also now it describes a content, and it says what type of information is returning. Very well, right? Okay, so from here, if we view the package JSON, we can see that in the scripts there is something called OpenAPI spec. So you can run, for example, npm run OpenAPI spec, and say, for example, the helloWorld.yaml file, and it will create the OpenAPI specification in YAML file. So let's BI it, and this is the same thing to the right, except that it is in YAML file. And why this file is really important? For example, let's generate the open JSON file right now. So we have the 2 one here. and let's go to the PostMan so that you can take a look at it. I'm going to create a new API. So the API is going to be calling the HelloWorld API, and it will be having the version 1.0. It's going to be either in JSON and YAML. Remember that in the previous video or session or slide, we created the JSON and the YAML. So I'm going to select the JSON here, and they are going to be already there. So these are the two ones that we created already, and that's it. I will create it, and I will be reviewing it right now. Okay, so here we have the hello world. I am the tester, for example, in this case, and I have the URL. And in the URL, I will have to place localhost 3000, for example, because that is where the ones. I have, as a tester, the ability to change it, and that's it. So from here, I will generate the collection. The collection name is going to be Hello World Collection, and this is going to be used for API documentation and generate the collection. So the collection is really the set of request types, pod, patch, or all whatever is exposed here. So let's go with the HelloWorldController. It doesn't have any body, it has a get. So as a tester, I can say, okay, let's test it and say send. In this case, it will return the word say hello, which is fine. The pin controller on another node, on the other hand, is going to be returning an object, right? The greetings, I can be preview, prettify, or whatever. So it's good. This API application is exposing two endpoints with the get operation, and they are working fine. So you see that from the tester perspective, I didn't have to communicate a lot with the developer. Once I could grab the Open API specification, that's it. Okay, so now let's go back to the Visual Studio Code and add a tester or a test acceptance test for the Hello World application. That's the only missing part that we have. This is the Visual Studio Code of the same application, Hello World, and here we have our controller. This is the Hello World controller that we specified already. This is the pin controller. Now let's talk about the tests. So the test here, LoopBack for this application that was scaffolded contains this helper. This helper initializes the application and a client and contributes to these two artifacts to the home page and the pin controller. I'm going to copy the code for the pin controller in this case, and I'm going to write the Hello World controller, Hello World controller acceptance TS file, and I'm going to be placing it here. I am describing the Hello World controller. Then I will just copy this here to have it like in the order, and I will be invoking the Hello World, and the client in this case is going to be the /Hello World. This client and the spec are part of the LoopBack test lab package, and they provide the test helper so that you can start writing your unit test or acceptance test. And in this case, it's gonna be creating the hello. In this case, I'm gonna be returning the hello, for example, and I'm gonna be returning the word in string. Notice how I change it, correct? So I'm gonna be changing the specification here for the returning. So I am trying to get hello world, and I need to compare the result with this object, the hello and the world object. Now I'm going to be saving it, okay, and I'm going to be running npm run test. It's going to be failing because the string doesn't match the object in this case. Okay, let's see. And we're almost done with this lesson. Basically, you see that it's saying that. Okay, so I just need to open the controller, the HelloWorld controller, and instead of this object, right, of this string, we're gonna return the hello world object, and of course we can return an object here, and it's gonna be saying, of course, that this context doesn't match, but we will be later on changing that. So npm run test, it should work now. And you see that this is really important in the framework also, because it gives you the starting point to build your own acceptance test, and the test passes. Okay, it's fine. So to close this lesson, I have something for you. I have created already. This is not, I'm not going to explain it in detail because that's going to be for the next lesson. But we have a table here. Okay, this table is LB4, password equals to LB4, and LB4 beginners. This is a MySQL table, and that exposes teams table. It exposes the ID, the first name, the last name. The ID is an increment. So I'm going to be creating right now our data source. This is going to be calling DS teams or DS beginners, right? DS LB4. Okay, rapidly. Not going to explain you, but I'm going to rapidly create this here. There are many ways to peel the cat. I'm going with the more complex one, which is creating all the artifacts one by one. LB4 beginners. Okay, I want to show you something really important. Not only the file that it creates, but also the testing unit that we can do in the PostMan. So once I have the data source with the connector already installed, it's time to create the model, and the model is going to be teams. The model here can be a different name, of course, from the table. This is an entity table, doesn't allow any free form. It's a formal database, RDBMS. The property is ID. This is a number. This is the primary key. Yes. Do you generate it automatically? Yes. The first name is going to be a string. It's required. Yes. The other one is last name, string, and it's required, and that's it. Now it's time to generate the repository. The repository's name is also repository teams. I'm selecting the data source and the teams with the default CRUD repository, and now I'm going to be creating the controller. Again, you can have one command to do it for you from the model up to the repository in the controller, but I'm doing it in a different way. So LB4 controller, and this is the teams controller, is going to be asking me for the type of controller. Now I select the REST controller. It's asking me for the model, for the repository, and for the ID. Why it didn't actually match the repository and the model? Well, because one model can have multiple repositories, and this is the ID, the primary key, which is a number. It's asking me if we should omit the ID from creating a new instances. I will say yes, and the path, let's leave it as teams, and that's it. That's it, right? Okay, so now let's remove the open_api.json file. Or everything, right? Open API, JSON, open API. What is teams? What was hello world? Sorry. So hello world.json. We're gonna remove it, and along with the YAML file. And the reason why it is because right now everything changed. Now it has a teams controller, for example, that injects the team's repository. It contains the data source, and it contains the model. So it's a plain TypeScript class with some decorators, and that's it. Let's leave it for the next lesson. So I just need to run npm start right now, and if everything works fine, it's going to be connecting to 3000. I'm going to open a new terminal here from it, and I'm going to be running npm run open API spec and hello with teams.json. Okay, so now hello with teams.json is here. Now it contains, for example, more interesting things. For example, how about the delete operation for teams? For example, it has the controller, delete by ID. It contains the parameters. Nothing how interesting it is. So the ID, the path, the query, everything is really, this is amazing because this is the one that I was talking about. So this is done automatically. You don't have to deal with the Open API. This is the button up approach, right? Now, what do you do with this little Open API specification? Then we can go, right now I'm gonna go and do the switch to the PostMan in the next video. In this PostMan, so I'm gonna create a new API. I'm gonna call it Hello World with Teams API. This is our version 2.0, all right? And this is gonna be a JSON format, and now is the Hello Teams. It's gonna be here. Probably you didn't see the pop-up screen, but only the file name here. And then I will create the API from here. Remember, now we have a HelloWorldController, and now we have a Teams controller. And double check it here. We need to find out the servers, all this specification, the parameters, the responses, everything is here. I just need to specify it here, localhost 3000 as the server, and that's it. I'm gonna be saving it. The file that we grab from the URL openapi.json file contains this URL populated, but we need, whenever we generate it from the command line, it does not, so that the tester, in this case my profile right now, can point to any server that I wish to test this API against. Now I just need to generate the collection. The collection is going to be the Hello World with Teams collection, and this is going to be for documentation and generate the collection. Okay, so now the collection is more interesting because it contains a lot of methods, right? So it contains the two endpoints we had before, but right now the most interesting part is these themes. This theme exposes a post, a patch. Let's call the get, for example. The get is telling me that we can specify a filter. We will review in subsequent lessons all this. It doesn't return, it doesn't need anything in the path or in the query, so I just click send. So here are the records, the number of records. If I go to the count, for example, that doesn't need anything here also, it will return 5. How about, for example, creating a new one? I just can create the theme, a new one. If I click the body right now, it's just populating already. So you see, for example, it's making my life easier as a tester and you as a developer, because the developer didn't really have to specify it or document in a separate way the API. So in this case, I'm gonna add another member here to the team. Let's call the member Rifa, and let's call Akrinsa, for example, and then let's call the post. Okay, so it returns the ID number 6 in the Rifa. Now, if we go to find again all of them, we will see that Rifa is in the number 6. How about, for example, if I want to change Mario Estrada last name? So I can go here and do a patch by ID, for example, And if I go with the body, for example, I see the ID here, and I don't remember which one I was, so I was the number 1, right? So I just select the ID here, number 1. I don't want to update the ID. I don't want to update probably let's update the first name. Okay, so it will say Mario F, and the last name is Estrada Rosa. Okay, so I will call the patch, the base URL, the teams number 1, and then that's it. So I will just click send. So it updated it. If I go back into the file, I will see that my last name and the first name change very easily, right? So this is a good feature for testing because it provides me a good overview without not too much hassle about it, right? And we can generate the collection, we can see a lot of things here. So I just hope you enjoyed. Let's basically be connected to subsequent lessons. Thank you for watching it, and start building applications and interesting with LoopBack 4. See you next time.